That Friday afternoon, I was ironing the last shirt for my son's suitcase, excited for our family cruise. Then my phone buzzed with a text from him. "You won't be joining us. It's just a trip for our family." But they had no idea what my late husband had left behind for me. But before we continue, check if you're subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. My name is Carol Peterson. I'm 68 years old, a retired high school English teacher living in Philadelphia. After my husband Richard passed away 5 years ago, my world became very small, centered entirely on my only son. My days were simple, tending to my ferns, reading books, and waiting for a call from Mark. He, his wife Tiffany, and my grandson Leo were my whole life. I lived for their visits. Mark had mentioned a family cruise months ago, calling it a gift for all of us. I spent the entire week packing my bags with a happy heart. I even bought a new dress, dreaming of seeing the ocean with my grandson. That Friday, I was ironing one of Mark's shirts when my phone chimed. It was the text. I read the first line over and over. "You won't be joining us." The words that followed were worse. "It's just a trip for our family." Our family. I put the iron down and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. The silence in the condo was absolute. I didn't cry. I just felt a cold, empty space in my chest. I knew this wasn't just about a vacation. It was the beginning of being erased. The phone rang an hour later. Mark's name flashed on the screen. I watched it vibrate on the nightstand, making a low, buzzing sound against the wood. It rang until it went to voicemail. I didn't move. My hand was still cold from where I had put the iron down. The packed suitcase stood by the door, a silent monument to my foolishness. I should have unpacked it, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It felt like admitting defeat. So I just sat there, listening to the silence that followed the ringing. Another call came that evening. I ignored it again. The sun went down, and the room grew dark, but I didn't turn on a light. I just sat on the edge of the bed, my back to the suitcase. I thought about Tiffany, imagining her smile as she told Mark he had handled it. She probably thought I would cry or call and make a scene. That was what she expected of me, an emotional burden. The thought made my stomach tighten, but still no tears came. It was a cold, hard knot of something else entirely. I finally stood up when the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 10 times. My legs were stiff. I walked into the living room and saw a picture of Richard on the mantel. He was smiling, his arm around my shoulder on a beach trip from years ago. He always said he had taken care of everything so I would never have to depend on anyone. I touched the cool glass of the frame. It seemed he had been wrong about that. I had become completely dependent on a son who could discard me with a text message. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Every small sound in the condo seemed amplified. I thought about all the years I had dedicated to Mark. I read to him every night. I helped him with his college applications. I gave him and Tiffany the down payment for their first house. I never saw it as a transaction. It was just what a mother did. Now, it felt like a series of bad investments that had left me bankrupt. The next morning was Saturday, the day they were supposed to leave for the cruise. I pictured them at the airport, Leo excited, Tiffany checking her phone, Mark looking relieved that the hard part was over. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Tiffany. "Hope you're doing okay, Carol. We'll bring you back a souvenir." The fake kindness was worse than the cruelty. It was a pat on the head for the old woman they had put in her place. I deleted the message without replying. I tried to go through my morning routine. I watered my ferns, their green leaves drooping slightly. I made coffee, but the taste was bitter in my mouth. I sat down with a book, one of my favorites, but I couldn't focus on the words. They were just black marks on a page. The story of someone else's life felt meaningless when mine had just been so thoroughly dismissed. I closed the book and put it back on the shelf. The silence in the condo was a physical weight, pressing down on me. I walked through the rooms of my home. It was filled with memories, but now they felt like ghosts. There was the armchair where I used to read stories to Leo, the dining table where we had celebrated his last birthday. Every object was a reminder of a connection that I now understood was conditional. I had thought my place in their family was permanent. I was the matriarch, the grandmother, but I was just a guest, and my invitation had been permanently revoked. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, saw me checking my mail in the hallway. "Carol, dear, aren't you supposed to be on your way to the Caribbean?" she asked, her voice cheerful. I felt a flush of heat rise up my neck. I forced a small smile. "Oh, there was a last-minute change of plans. Mark had a work thing come up. We've postponed it." The lie came out easily, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't want to see anyone. The shame of that lie stayed with me all day. I had always been an honest person. Now I was hiding in my own home, lying to my neighbors to protect my son's image, to protect my own pride. But what pride was left? I had been reduced to a secret, an inconvenience they had neatly tucked away so they could enjoy their vacation. The thought made me want to be sick. I felt small, insignificant, and utterly alone in my perfectly kept, silent condo that now felt like a cage. I spent Sunday just staring out the window. The world went on. Cars drove by. People walked their dogs. Families went to the park. I was watching it all from behind a pane of glass, completely disconnected. I felt like I was fading. My phone stayed silent all day. No guilty calls from Mark. No polite texts from Tiffany. They were on the ship now. They had moved on. The silence from them was the confirmation I needed. I was forgotten, a problem that no longer existed for them. My mind kept drifting back to Leo. He was the only one whose feelings I couldn't guess. Did he ask where I was? What did they tell him? I imagined Tiffany saying, "Grandma wasn't feeling well." A simple, clean lie that would satisfy a child. She was good at those. She was slowly, carefully, pruning me from his life, limiting my visits, interrupting our phone calls. I saw the pattern so clearly now. The cruise wasn't a beginning. It was an ending she had been planning for a long time. I started to doubt myself. Had I become that stereotypical meddling mother-in-law? I replayed every recent visit in my head. Did I offer too much advice? Did I overstay my welcome? I had tried so hard to be helpful, not a burden. I cooked their favorite meals when they visited. I always brought a gift for Leo. I never showed up unannounced. But maybe my very presence was the problem. Maybe just being there was too much for them. A reminder of a life before their perfect family unit. The feeling of failure was overwhelming. I had failed as a mother, raising a son who couldn't stand up to his wife or even speak to me directly. I had failed as a mother-in-law, unable to forge a real connection with Tiffany. And I had failed myself, allowing my entire world to shrink until it fit inside their lives. Richard would have been so disappointed. He had always been so independent, so full of life. I had become the opposite of him, a ghost in my own home. On Monday, I decided I had to do something. I opened my suitcase and started to unpack. Each item felt heavy with disappointment. The new dress I had bought, still with its tags on, the travel-sized sunscreen, the book I had planned to read on the deck. I folded each piece of clothing slowly, methodically. It was a mechanical task, something to keep my hands busy and my mind from screaming. But with each folded shirt, the finality of it all settled deeper into my bones. After unpacking, I put the empty suitcase back in the closet and closed the door. Out of sight, out of mind. But it wasn't true. The emptiness was now inside me. The condo felt too big, too quiet. I turned on the television for some background noise, but the cheerful voices on the daytime shows felt jarring. They were talking about recipes and celebrity gossip. It was a world I no longer felt a part of. I turned it off, and the silence rushed back in, louder than before. I found myself looking through old photo albums, pictures of Mark as a baby, as a teenager, at his college graduation. In every photo, I was there, beaming with pride. Then came the pictures with Tiffany. My smile was still there, but it looked a little more forced. I saw it now. I had been trying so hard to be accepted, to be part of their new unit. I was always on the edge of the frame, never in the center. A supporting character in a story I thought was also mine. There was one picture of Richard and me, taken a few months before he passed. We were on a trip to the mountains. We looked so happy, so content in our own company. We had our own life, our own adventures. How had I forgotten that? After he died, I had poured all of that energy, all of that love, into Mark's family. I had let my own world disappear. It wasn't just them who had erased me. I had handed them the eraser and showed them where to start. A wave of cold clarity washed over me. This wasn't just about a missed vacation. This was about the last 5 years of my life. I had been living in a state of suspended animation, waiting for their calls, planning my weeks around their visits. I had turned my son and his family into my purpose, and when they took that away, I had nothing left. The realization was terrifying. I was 68 years old, and I had no idea who I was without them. I was a stranger to myself. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest. It wasn't the sharp pain of betrayal anymore. It was the dull throb of loss. I had lost my son, not to death, but to indifference. I had lost my role as a grandmother, and worst of all, I had lost myself. The woman in the photograph with Richard, the one with a life of her own, was a stranger to me now. I felt completely and utterly adrift, with no anchor and no shore in sight, floating in an ocean of my own making. The days began to blur together. Tuesday, Wednesday. I barely ate. I just drank coffee and sat in the living room. I didn't answer the phone, which had stopped ringing anyway. They were in the middle of the ocean, enjoying the sun. They weren't thinking of me. The thought no longer hurt. It was just a fact. I was a loose end they had tied off. A problem that had been solved with a few taps on a screen, as easy as deleting an unwanted email. I felt trapped inside my own home, surrounded by the evidence of a life that was no longer mine. The photos on the wall, the drawings from Leo on the refrigerator, the extra chair at the dining table. It was a museum dedicated to a family that had moved on without me. I needed to change something, to do something, but I was paralyzed by a profound sense of helplessness. Where would I even begin to dismantle a life I had so carefully built around other people? My world had become 4 walls and a window overlooking a street of strangers. I had friends, other retired teachers, but I hadn't called them. What would I say? How could I explain that my own son had disowned me without sounding pathetic or bitter? So I stayed silent, letting the isolation grow. It wrapped around me like a thick fog, muffling the rest of the world and leaving me alone with my thoughts, which circled endlessly around the same painful point. The loneliness was a constant presence now. It sat with me at the kitchen table in the morning and lay beside me in the empty bed at night. I had been alone since Richard died, but I had never felt truly lonely until now. Before, there was always the hope of a visit, the anticipation of a call. Now there was just silence. A vast, empty silence that stretched out into a future I couldn't bear to imagine. It was a future without a purpose. I felt like I was at the bottom of a deep well. I could see a small circle of light far above, but I had no way to climb out. The energy it would take to even try felt monumental. It was easier to just stay in the dark, to accept that this was my life now. A quiet, solitary existence in a condo full of memories. A useless old woman, just as Tiffany had always seen me. I had finally started to believe it myself, and that was the most devastating part of all. On Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in Richard's old leather armchair, the one he always read in. I looked across the room at a stack of cardboard boxes in the corner. They were filled with his old papers and files, things I was supposed to sort through years ago, but never had the heart to. I had no will to do it now, either. I just stared at them, another task left undone. I felt completely stuck, cornered by my own life, with no idea where to go from here. My gaze fell upon the stack of cardboard boxes in the corner, untouched for 5 years. They held Richard's old life, his papers and files from work. things I couldn't bear to face after he was gone. They were a monument to my own paralysis, a physical representation of how stuck I had become. Just looking at them made me feel tired, a deep-in-the-bones exhaustion that had become my constant companion. I had no energy to sort through them, no reason to. It was just another task on a list I had no intention of completing. My life was a series of undone tasks and quiet rooms. For some reason, I couldn't look away from them this time. The boxes were just sitting there, covered in a thin layer of dust, silent witnesses to my slow fade. I thought about what was inside: old blueprints, financial reports, maybe letters I had never seen. It was a whole world that had belonged to him, a world I had sealed away. I had told myself it was out of respect for his memory, but that was a lie. It was fear. I was afraid of what I might find, and even more afraid of the finality of putting his life in order. It would be like losing him all over again. I stayed in that armchair for another hour, just staring. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the seconds, each one a small, metallic sound in the crushing silence. The sun shifted, and a beam of light hit the top box, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Something inside me stirred, a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It wasn't hope, either. It was just a small, insistent thought. I needed a document, my own birth certificate. I remembered vaguely packing it away with some of his important papers after he passed, thinking it was a safe place. The thought was an anchor, something practical to hold on to. I needed to find it. I stood up from the armchair, my joints protesting. I walked over to the stack of boxes, my reflection a faint ghost in the window beside them. I knelt down on the floor, the cold of the wood seeping through my pants. The top box was labeled Financials 1990-2000. That wasn't it. I pushed it aside, the sound of cardboard scraping against the floor loud in the quiet room. The next box was labeled Personal Documents. This was the one. I pulled it toward me. The tape was old and brittle. It peeled off with a dry, cracking sound. I lifted the flaps and looked inside. It was filled with manila folders, each one neatly labeled in Richard's precise handwriting. Wills, insurance policies, property deeds. It was the architecture of our shared life, organized and contained. I felt a pang in my chest, a familiar ache. He had always been the one to handle these things, to make sure everything was in its place. He took care of everything so I wouldn't have to worry. I started lifting the folders out one by one, looking for the one that might hold my certificate. I went through folders labeled car titles and medical records. My hands moved slowly, methodically. It was a task, and having a task felt better than having nothing. I wasn't thinking about Mark or the cruise. I was just focused on the papers in front of me, the crisp feel of them between my fingers. I was halfway through the box when I saw it. It wasn't a folder. It was a dark brown leather portfolio, tucked at the very bottom beneath everything else. It looked different from the other items, more personal, less official. It had no dust on it. I lifted the portfolio out of the box. The leather was smooth and cool to the touch. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. On the front, embossed in small gold letters, were two words, Travel Fund, and below that, just two initials, C&R, Carol and Richard. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't remember this. I had no memory of him ever mentioning a specific fund for travel. We had traveled, of course, but it was always just paid for out of our regular budget. This felt like a secret he had kept. I sat back on my heels, the portfolio resting on my lap. I traced the letters with my finger. C&R. It felt like a message from another lifetime. A part of me didn't want to open it. It felt too private, like I was intruding on something that was just his. Maybe it was an old dream of his he never got to, a plan he made before he got sick. But he had put my initial on it, too. It was for both of us. My curiosity finally won over my hesitation. I unsnapped the two small brass buttons on the front. Inside, it was just as organized as the rest of his files. There were several thick documents held in place by a leather strap. The top one was a statement for an investment portfolio. I didn't recognize the name of the financial firm. I pulled the statement out. The date on it was recent, from just last month. I scanned the page, my eyes trying to make sense of the columns of numbers and symbols. I looked for the bottom line, the final balance. When I found it, I had to read it 3 times to be sure I wasn't mistaken. The number was staggering. I put the paper down on the floor, my hand trembling slightly. It couldn't be right. It was more money than I had ever imagined. Far more than what I lived on from my pension and his survivor benefits. It was a fortune. I picked up the next document. It was a letter from Richard, in a sealed envelope with my name on it. His familiar handwriting looked back at me from the past. I opened it carefully. "My dearest Carol," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you found our adventure fund. I started this the year Mark went to college. I wanted to make sure we had a life of our own after our job as parents was done." The letter went on to explain everything. He had been investing a small part of his salary for decades, a secret nest egg just for us. It was for grand celebrations and adventures, for seeing the world. "I've taken care of everything," he wrote, "so you'll never have to depend on anyone, not even Mark. This is yours, Carol. Your life. Go live it." The tears I hadn't shed all week finally came. They weren't tears of sadness for my son's cruelty, but tears of overwhelming love for the man who had known me so well, who was still taking care of me even now. I sat there on the floor for a long time, the letter in my hand. Richard's voice was so clear in my head. He had seen this coming, in a way. Not the specific cruelty of a text message, but the possibility that I might lose myself in being a mother and a grandmother. He had left me a map, a way out that I never knew existed. He had left me a choice. I could continue to be the sad, lonely woman waiting by the phone, or I could be the woman he had written this letter to, the woman he believed I was. Then, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Tucked into a side pocket of the portfolio was another bank statement, this one for a small joint savings account I shared with Mark. I barely used it. I saw a recent withdrawal, $5,000. The transaction date was 2 months ago, right around the time Mark had first mentioned the work bonus that was paying for the cruise. He hadn't gotten a bonus. He had taken the money from me, from an account I kept for emergencies, and then he had uninvited me from the trip he bought with my own funds. The realization didn't bring anger. It brought a strange, cold clarity. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it was almost abstract. It wasn't just Tiffany's influence. It was Mark's own weakness and dishonesty. He had lied to me, used my money, and then discarded me when I became inconvenient. He had treated me not like his mother, but like an ATM that had outlived its usefulness. The last bit of illusion I had about my son, the idea that he was a good man, manipulated by his wife, shattered completely. He was a willing participant. I carefully placed all the documents back into the portfolio, except for Richard's letter. I held on to that. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, my movement steady and deliberate. I made myself a cup of tea. As I waited for the water to boil, I looked out the window. The world outside looked exactly the same, but I felt like a different person was seeing it. The fog of grief and helplessness that had surrounded me for days was beginning to lift. It was being replaced by something else, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. It felt like resolve. The initial thought was to call Mark, to confront him. I imagined the conversation, his stammering excuses, his blame shifting, Tiffany's voice in the background telling him to hang up. What would it accomplish? It would give them the drama they expected. It would confirm their image of me as a hysterical old woman. It would change nothing. Confrontation was their language, not mine. Richard had never solved problems with shouting. He had solved them with quiet, decisive action. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt like his wife again, not just his widow. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my tea. I thought about the money. My first instinct, born of years of frugal living, was to protect it, to save it, to not touch it. It felt like Richard's money, not mine. It was for a future that we were supposed to have together. Using it alone felt like a betrayal of that dream. The habit of thinking small, of making myself smaller to fit into other people's lives, was deeply ingrained. My world had been my condo, my ferns, and waiting for my son's family to need me. This portfolio represented a world that was terrifyingly large, but Richard's words echoed in my head. "This is yours, Carol. Your life. Go live it." He hadn't said, "our life." He had written this letter for me, for the me who would be reading it alone. He had planned for this exact moment. He was giving me permission, not just permission to spend the money, but permission to have a life that was not defined by my role as a mother or a widow. He was giving me back to myself. The thought was both liberating and frightening. Who was I, if not Mark's mother? I thought about Italy. For 40 years, I had taught my students about the Renaissance, about the art of Florence, the history of Rome. I showed them slides of the Colosseum and the Sistine Chapel, describing places I had only ever seen in books. I had always dreamed of going, a vague, someday dream that Richard and I had talked about but never planned. It was my dream, more than his. He would have gone for me, to see me happy. Now, someday, was here. It was sitting in a leather portfolio on my living room floor. The doubt lingered for a moment longer. Could I do it? Travel alone? At my age? Navigate airports and foreign cities by myself? The idea was daunting. It was so far outside the small, safe box I had built around myself. It would be easier to just put the portfolio back in the box, secure my finances, and continue my quiet life. No one would have to know. I could just be a little more comfortable in my cage. But the image of my son's text message flashed in my mind. "It's just a trip for our family." That was the final push. They had defined their family, and I was not in it. They had their ship, their ocean. Richard had left me my own. The fear of traveling alone was suddenly much smaller than the fear of sitting in this condo for the next 20 years, slowly turning into a ghost. The fear of the unknown was less than the certainty of a lonely, silent future. I deserved more than to be an anecdote they told their friends, the sad mother-in-law they had to leave behind. I deserved a life. I stood up and walked back into the living room. I picked up the portfolio, no longer hesitating. The leather felt warm in my hands now, like a promise. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. The screen lit up, illuminating my face. I knew exactly what I was looking for. I typed 15-day solo tours of Italy into the search bar. The screen filled with images of sun-drenched Tuscan hills, ancient Roman ruins, and Venetian canals. It was a world away from my silent condo. I felt a surge of adrenaline, of pure, unadulterated purpose. I wasn't running away from my life. I was finally running toward one, my own. I clicked on the first link. I started reading about itineraries and dates. There was a tour leaving in 2 weeks. It was perfect. I wasn't thinking about Mark or Tiffany anymore. They were a chapter that had just ended. I was about to start writing a new one, and this time, I would be the main character. I looked at the picture on the mantle, the one of Richard and me on our mountain trip. He was smiling, and I was smiling back at him. I could almost hear him whispering, "It's about time, Carol. It's about time." I took a deep breath and clicked the Book Now button. The decision was made. I wasn't just unpacking a suitcase from a cruise I would never take. I was about to start packing for a journey I had been waiting my whole life to begin. The resistance was gone, replaced by a quiet excitement. I spent the rest of the afternoon making plans, not with the frantic energy of escape, but with the calm focus of someone who knows exactly where she is going. I looked up the weather in Florence. I made a list of the museums I wanted to see in Rome. Each small act of planning was an act of reclaiming myself. I was no longer Carol Peterson, the forgotten mother. I was Carol Peterson, a woman who was about to see Italy. I accepted the change not as a bitter response, but as a joyful liberation. The cruelty of my son's text message had been a key, unlocking a door I never knew was there. He thought he was putting me in a cage, but he had inadvertently set me free. The world he had tried to shrink had just become bigger than he could possibly imagine. I closed my laptop and looked around the quiet condo. It no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a starting point. The first challenge was the suitcase. It sat open on my bed, the same one I had packed for the cruise, now a symbol of a different journey. My instinct was to pack for every possibility, to fill it with things I might need. A habit born from years of caring for others. I pulled out 3 heavy sweaters, 2 extra pairs of shoes, and a pile of books. It was too much. I was trying to pack my old life, my old fears. I had to learn to travel light, and that started here, in my bedroom. I left only the essentials, the suitcase feeling unnervingly empty but manageable. Navigating the Philadelphia airport alone was a jarring experience. For decades, Richard had handled the tickets, the check-in, the luggage. Mark did it after him. Now, I was the one standing in front of the self-service kiosk, my fingers fumbling on the touchscreen. I felt a flush of embarrassment as a young man in a hurry sighed impatiently behind me. I felt ancient, slow, and completely out of place. It was a stark reminder of the world I had been insulated from, a world that moved at a speed I was no longer used to. I finally got my boarding pass, my hand shaking slightly as I walked toward security. The long flight over the Atlantic was a study in isolation. I was surrounded by chattering families, couples holding hands, and students excited for their European adventures. I sat by the window, a book open on my lap, but I didn't read a single page. Every laugh I overheard felt like a commentary on my solitude. I kept the shade down and tried to sleep, but my mind raced. Was this a mistake? Had I confused a grand gesture with a practical plan? The thought of landing in a foreign country where I knew no one and barely spoke the language felt less like an adventure and more like a punishment. Arriving in Rome was a sensory assault. The noise of the airport, the rapid-fire Italian I couldn't understand, the aggressive drivers on the road. It was nothing like the travel shows on television. The taxi driver took my address with a shrug and sped into the chaotic traffic, pointing out landmarks that were just a blur outside my window. I clutched my purse in my lap, feeling like a small, fragile thing that could easily be swept away by the current of the city. I felt a profound sense of being an outsider, a tourist in the most literal and lonely sense of the word. My first night in the hotel was the hardest. The room was clean and modern, but it felt cold and impersonal. I unpacked my few belongings, trying to make the space my own, but it was useless. I went down to the hotel restaurant for dinner, feeling the eyes of every other diner on me, the lone woman at a table for 2. I ate my pasta quickly, not tasting it, just wanting to escape the feeling of being on display. Back in my room, the silence was as heavy as it had been in my condo, but this time it was underlined by the unfamiliar sounds of a foreign city outside my window. The next morning, I was determined to start my adventure. Armed with a map, I set out to find the Pantheon. But the map was confusing, the street signs were different, and the winding cobblestone alleys all looked the same. Within an hour, I was completely and utterly lost. A wave of panic washed over me, cold and sharp. I stood in the middle of a crowded piazza, my heart pounding, feeling foolish and incompetent. Tiffany's imagined voice was in my ear, mocking me. See? You can't even manage a simple walk. Old and useless. I wanted to cry, to find a taxi and go straight back to the hotel. But I didn't. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. I remembered a phrase from a travel book. Mi scusi, dove si trova? I approached a woman selling flowers from a small cart. My voice trembled as I asked for the Pantheon in my clumsy, broken Italian. She smiled, a warm and genuine expression, and pointed down a narrow street, giving me simple directions with her hands. I followed them, and 5 minutes later, I was standing before the ancient temple. It wasn't just a victory over getting lost. It was the first proof that I could rely on myself. That small success sparked a change. I decided to stop trying to conquer the city and instead just exist within it. I started a new habit, waking up at dawn and walking to a major landmark before the tourist crowds arrived. Seeing the Trevi Fountain with only a handful of other people, the morning light hitting the water, felt like a private showing. It was a quiet, disciplined act that gave me a sense of ownership over my day. I wasn't just a tourist being herded from one place to another. I was an observer, finding my own rhythm in a city that had existed for millennia. The internal conflicts didn't vanish, though. One afternoon near the Colosseum, I saw a grandmother chasing her laughing grandson, his small hand in hers. The sight was a physical blow, and the grief for Leo, for the relationship I was losing, was overwhelming. I had to sit down on a bench, my eyes blurring with tears I refused to let fall. The old thoughts returned, whispering that I was selfish, that I had abandoned my family for this indulgent trip. It was a constant battle to remind myself that they were the ones who had left me, not the other way around. The external world presented its own challenges. On a guided tour of the Vatican, I felt invisible. The guide spoke quickly, addressing the younger members of the group, and when I raised my hand to ask a question, he gave a curt answer and moved on. Younger tourists would push past me to get a better photo, their impatience a clear signal that I was in their way. In those moments, I felt every one of my 68 years. It would have been easy to retreat, to decide that these places were no longer for people like me, but I held my ground, determined to see what I had come to see. To counter the loneliness, I formed another new habit. I found a small cafe, a bar, as the locals called it, a few blocks from my hotel. I went there every morning for my cappuccino and cornetto. At first, the barista was brisk and professional, but by the fourth day, he greeted me with a nod and a small smile. "Il solito?" he'd ask. The usual. It was a small thing, being recognized, but it made me feel like I belonged, even in a fleeting, temporary way. It was an anchor in my day, a moment of familiar comfort in a world of newness. A fundamental shift began to happen in my mind. I stopped looking at my itinerary as a checklist to be completed. One afternoon, I was supposed to visit another museum, but I was tired. Instead, I bought a piece of cheese, some bread, and a small bottle of wine, and sat on a bench in the Borghese Gardens. I just watched. I watched families play. I watched couples argue. I watched old men read newspapers. I realized the point of the trip wasn't just to see things. It was to be here. I was learning to enjoy my own company, to find richness in simple observation rather than constant activity. My confidence grew with each passing day in Rome. I learned the bus routes, no longer afraid of getting on the wrong one. I found a small leather shop and haggled for a new wallet, my rusty Italian getting me a small discount and a hearty laugh from the owner. I went to a classical music concert held in an old church, sitting by myself in a wooden pew, letting the music wash over me. These weren't grand adventures, but they were small, steady steps away from the helpless woman I had been just a week before. I was building a new version of myself, one small success at a time. Still, the ghost of my old life lingered. One evening, looking at my bank account online, I felt a sharp pang of guilt at the expense. The amount of money I was spending on myself in one day was more than I would have spent in a month back home. It felt extravagant, wasteful. I heard Richard's voice, not scolding me, but his words from the letter. "This is yours, Carol. Your life. Go live it." He hadn't meant for me to hoard it. He meant for me to use it. This wasn't an expense. It was the investment he had always intended for me to make in myself. The train ride from Rome to Florence was a revelation. As the Italian countryside sped past my window, I felt a sense of calm competence I hadn't known was possible. I had successfully navigated the chaotic Termini station, found my platform, and boarded the correct train without any help. I wasn't the terrified woman who had landed in Rome. I was a traveler. I watched the rolling hills of Tuscany, dotted with cypress trees, and I felt a quiet, profound sense of accomplishment. I was moving forward, both literally and figuratively, under my own power. Florence felt different immediately. It was smaller than Rome, more intimate. The art was everywhere, not just in the museums, but in the architecture, the statues in the public squares, the very air of the city. Because I arrived with more confidence, I experienced it differently. I didn't feel like an intruder. I walked the streets with a purpose, my map now a tool, not a crutch. I found my hotel easily and checked in with a confident "Buongiorno," my accent still terrible but my delivery firm. The city felt like a reward for having survived the challenges of Rome. I started a new practice in Florence. I bought a small, unlined notebook and a pencil. I found a spot near the Ponte Vecchio and started to sketch, something I hadn't done since I was a girl. My drawings were clumsy and amateurish, but it didn't matter. The act of looking at something long enough to draw it, of truly seeing the details, was a form of meditation. It focused my mind and connected me to my surroundings in a way a photograph never could. It was an act of creation, and it made me feel alive and present in a way I hadn't in years. One evening, I went to a well-regarded restaurant for dinner. The host, seeing me alone, tried to lead me to a small, undesirable table near the noisy kitchen entrance. The old Carol would have accepted it without a word, not wanting to make a fuss. But the new Carol stopped. "No, thank you," I said, my voice steady. "I would prefer that table by the window." The host was taken aback for a second, then nodded and led me to the much better table. It was a small act of self-advocacy, but it felt monumental. I was no longer willing to accept the scraps. In the Uffizi Gallery, I found myself standing next to another woman of a similar age, also alone. We were both looking at Botticelli's Primavera. We didn't speak. We just exchanged a brief look, a small, knowing smile that acknowledged our shared experience. It was a moment of silent solidarity, a recognition that we were not anomalies. We were part of a quiet tribe of women navigating the world on our own terms. In that fleeting connection, I felt seen and understood, and the last vestiges of my self-consciousness about being alone simply fell away. My confidence peaked when I decided to take a day trip to Siena, a medieval town in the heart of Tuscany. I didn't book a tour. I figured out the local bus schedule myself, bought a ticket from a small tobacco shop, and found the correct bus station on the outskirts of Florence. The entire day was my own creation. I wandered the winding streets of Siena, ate lunch in the Piazza del Campo, and returned to Florence in the evening, exhausted but exhilarated. I had done it all myself. The feeling of capability was a warm, solid presence inside me. I found myself thinking of Mark less and less. When he did cross my mind, the sharp pain of his betrayal was gone. It had been replaced by a kind of detached sadness. I felt sorry for him. I saw him not as a monster, but as a weak man, a person so afraid of his wife's disapproval that he would wound his own mother. He was trapped in a life of his own making, and I was, for the first time, free. My world was expanding with every new street I explored, while his was confined to his perfect, curated family. On my last afternoon in Florence, I sat at an outdoor cafe with a view of the Duomo. I bought a postcard, a beautiful photograph of the city at sunset. I thought for a long time about what to write. There was no anger left, no need for revenge. I simply wrote the truth. "Dear Mark, I hope you enjoy the ocean. I decided to revisit some stories of my own. With love, Mom." I sealed it, stamped it, and dropped it into a mailbox. It was an act of closure, a final, quiet severing of the old dynamic. I was no longer waiting for his apology. That evening, I treated myself to a nice dinner and a glass of Chianti. I sat in a bustling piazza, the sounds of conversation and music swirling around me. I didn't feel lonely. I felt peaceful. I was a part of the scenery, a woman enjoying a meal, content in her own skin. I had spent 2 weeks in a foreign country, navigating challenges, overcoming fears, and rediscovering a strength I thought I had lost forever. I had become the protagonist of my own story, the one Richard always knew I could be. As I was finishing my wine, my phone, which had been silent for 2 weeks, buzzed on the table. I picked it up. It was a text from Mark. The postcard had arrived. "Mom, where are you? We got a weird postcard? Call me." I read the words, and I felt nothing. No spike of adrenaline, no lurch of my stomach, no desperate need to explain myself. The old Carol would have dropped everything to call him back, to soothe his confusion, to seek his approval. But I was no longer that woman. I looked at his message, a demand from a world that felt very far away. Then I looked up at the facade of the Palazzo Vecchio, beautifully lit against the dark blue of the evening sky. I put my phone face down on the table, picked up my glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip of wine. The message could wait. My son was no longer the center of my world. I was, and my evening in Florence had just begun. Flying back into Philadelphia felt like returning to a different city, or perhaps returning as a different person. The airport, which had seemed so intimidating and vast on my departure, now felt manageable, just a place of transit. I moved through the crowds with a quiet confidence that was entirely new, pulling my single, lightweight suitcase behind me. I wasn't the hesitant, fearful woman who had fumbled with the check-in screen weeks ago. I was a traveler who had navigated Rome and Florence on her own. The air of my home city felt the same, but I was breathing it in differently, with lungs that felt larger and stronger. The key slid into the lock of my condo, and I stepped inside. The silence that greeted me was not the oppressive, heavy blanket I had left behind. It was a peaceful quiet, the comforting hum of a place that was truly my own. It was no longer a cage of lonely memories, but my home base, the starting point for my adventures. I looked at the photograph of Mark, Tiffany, and Leo on the mantel, and for the first time, I felt a gentle detachment, not a painful ache. The ticking of the grandfather clock was simply the sound of my own time, a rhythm I now controlled. The act of unpacking was a quiet ceremony of transformation. The last time I had emptied a suitcase in this room, it was an act of crushing defeat. This time, it was a celebration. I carefully unwrapped the small treasures I had bought for myself: a leather journal from Florence, a brightly painted ceramic bowl from a Sienese artisan, a silk scarf with the colors of the Tuscan sunset. I cleared a space on the bookshelf, moving a framed photo of Mark's family to a less prominent spot, and placed my new objects there. They were tangible proof of a life lived for me, by me. The phone rang that evening, and I knew it would be him. Mark's voice was a frantic jumble of words. Mom, where have you been? We were worried sick. Your phone went straight to voicemail for 2 weeks." The panic in his voice felt manufactured, a product of his own guilt and the shock of his world being disrupted. The old Carol would have immediately apologized for causing him worry. The new Carol stood calmly, looking at the city lights from her window, and said with perfect serenity, "There was no need to worry, Mark. I was perfectly fine. I was traveling." My simple, calm statement was a conversational bomb. It completely disarmed him. He was prepared for tears, for accusations, for the emotional drama he had come to expect from me. He was not prepared for tranquility. Traveling. Where? Why didn't you tell us? He stammered, his voice a mixture of confusion and indignation. He was scrambling to regain control of the narrative, to understand the data that didn't fit his image of me. I refused to give him that power. "It was a personal trip," I replied, my voice gentle but firm. "I just needed some time for myself." It wasn't long before I heard Tiffany's sharp voice in the background, and then she was on the phone. Carol. That was an incredibly reckless and selfish thing to do. "Anything could have happened to you. We were worried sick," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. It was a transparent attempt to reframe my independence as a childish whim, to make me feel guilty for stepping outside the role she had assigned me. I simply listened, offering no defense, no apology. My silence was a shield her words couldn't penetrate. The power of her judgment was gone, because I no longer sought her approval. In the days that followed, I began to build the framework of my new life. It wasn't about grand, dramatic changes, but small, steady acts of self-investment. I enrolled in a beginner's Italian course at a local college, the oldest student in a class of bright-eyed youths. I joined a hiking club that met on Saturday mornings, trading my quiet condo for the wooded trails of the Wissahickon Valley. I was creating a life that didn't have empty spaces waiting to be filled by my son's family. I was filling them myself, with my own interests and my own newfound friends. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, saw me returning from a hike one morning, my cheeks flushed and my eyes bright. "Carol, my goodness, you look like you've been on a health retreat," she exclaimed. This time, there was no lie, no shame. I smiled, a genuine, unforced expression. "Something like that," I said. "I just got back from Italy and I'm trying to keep the momentum going." Her eyes widened with genuine delight and admiration. "Italy? How wonderful for you." That simple, honest validation from a neighbor felt more meaningful than any panicked phone call from my son. Of course, Mark and Tiffany demanded a summit. They invited me to dinner at their house, an invitation that felt more like a summons. The entire meal was a thinly veiled interrogation. They wanted to know where the money came from, who I went with, what my plans were now. They were trying to solve the puzzle of the new Carol, to find the edges of my new life so they could put a fence around it. They needed to understand my independence so they could find a way to manage it, to bring me back into their orbit, even if on a longer leash. I shared pleasant stories about the art and the food, keeping my answers light and general. I was a gracious guest, but I was no longer an open book. When Tiffany finally asked the question that was burning on her mind, "But honestly, Carol, how did you pay for a trip like that?" I gave her a serene smile. I looked at Mark, then back at her. "Richard was a wonderful husband and a very meticulous planner," I said softly. "He made sure I would always be taken care of. I let them believe my freedom came from a man, not from myself. It was an answer they could understand, and it kept my true source of strength, my own will, safely hidden." A week later, Mark brought Leo over for a visit. I knew it was a strategic move, using my grandson to get past my new defenses, but I refused to play the game. I didn't speak a word about the cruise or his parents. Instead, I sat with Leo on the floor, my sketchbook open between us. I showed him my clumsy drawings of the Colosseum and told him stories of the brave gladiators. I taught him how to say ciao and gelato. He was enthralled. In that moment, I wasn't just his grandmother. I was a person with a world of her own, a world he was now curious about. This internal shift began to radiate outward. My posture changed. I walked with my head held a little higher. At my new book club, I found myself sharing my opinions on novels with a clarity and confidence I hadn't felt since I was teaching. The trip had done more than show me the world. It had reintroduced me to myself. I was rediscovering the woman I had been before my identity was subsumed by the roles of wife and mother. A woman who was intelligent, capable, and had a voice worth hearing. And I realized I had missed her dearly. The financial reckoning I knew was coming arrived via a tense phone call from Mark. "Mom, I was just looking at our joint savings account. It's been closed." His voice was tight with accusation, as if I had stolen something from him. The old me would have been flustered, defensive, but I was calm, my voice even. "Yes, I decided to consolidate my accounts. Mark, it was an emergency fund your father set up for me years ago. I'm just reorganizing things to better suit my current plans." I didn't mention the $5,000 he had taken. I didn't have to. The boundary had been drawn in stone. I could hear Tiffany's angry whisper in the background, a stage whisper meant for me to hear. "He told you, Mark. She's cutting you out. She's going to spend your entire inheritance on herself." And there it was, the ugly truth laid bare. In their eyes, my life was merely a waiting period, and my resources were simply their future assets. The realization didn't sting with the fresh pain of betrayal anymore. It was a sad, clinical diagnosis of a relationship that had been sick for a very long time. It affirmed, with absolute certainty, that my journey toward independence was not just a choice, but a necessity for survival. That night, I sat in Richard's armchair, his letter in my lap. I looked at the dark brown portfolio, no longer a symbol of a secret, but a testament to a deep and abiding love. I thought of the woman who had sat in this very chair just weeks before, a ghost in her own home, paralyzed by a text message. I felt a wave of compassion for her, for the pain she had endured. She had to break completely before she could begin to rebuild. Richard hadn't just left me money, he had left me a key, but I was the one who had to be brave enough to turn it in the lock. My next conquest was quiet but decisive. I went online and booked another trip, a week-long tour of the national parks in Utah and Arizona. I had always wanted to see the Grand Canyon. I didn't ask for permission or opinions. I made the arrangements, paid the deposit, and only mentioned it to Mark in passing a week later. "Oh, I'll be away for the first week of June," I said casually. "I'm going to see the canyons." His only response was a subdued, "Okay, Mom. Have a good time." The fight was over. He had finally understood that my life was no longer subject to his approval. The greatest victory, however, was intangible. It was the complete eradication of my fear of being alone. I began to cherish my solitude, to see it as a space for growth and reflection, not a sign of abandonment. I could spend an entire day reading, walking, and dining by myself and feel utterly content. The gnawing loneliness that had defined my widowhood was gone. I had discovered the profound difference between being alone and being lonely. My life was now so full of my own purpose that there was simply no room for that old, hollow feeling. The contrast between the woman I was and the woman I had become was stark. Before, my days were structured around waiting for a phone call, an invitation, a sign that I was still needed. My happiness was a fragile thing, held in the hands of others. My world was four walls. Now, my days were structured around my own plans. Language class, a walk in the park, planning my next journey. My happiness was a resilient internal flame that I tended myself. My world had no walls, only horizons. I was no longer a supporting character in my son's story. I was the hero of my own. One afternoon at a local coffee shop, a young woman from my Italian class sat down at my table. "Can I ask you something, Carol?" she said. "You just seem so fearless, traveling to Italy all by yourself. I hope I have your courage when I'm your age." The word fearless resonated deep within me. I thought of my panic in that Roman piazza, my trembling hands at the airport. I wasn't fearless, I told her honestly. I was terrified, but I realized that I was more afraid of what my life would become if I stayed home. Courage, I had learned, was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it be the final word. My journey had given me a new clarity. I realized my story was the story of so many people, especially women of my generation. We were taught to be caregivers, to pour ourselves into our families until our own cups were empty. We made our children the center of our universe, and then we were shocked to find ourselves adrift when their universes no longer had a place for us. My trip was not about escaping my family. It was about the urgent, necessary act of refilling my own cup, of remembering that my life had value independent of my usefulness to anyone else. The final test came a month later. Mark called, his voice hesitant. He and Tiffany wanted to buy a new car, and they were a little short on the down payment. He asked if I could lend them the money. The old Carol would have liquidated a savings bond without a second thought, eager to be needed again. But I knew this was not about a car. It was about pulling me back into the old dynamic of dependency. "I'm sorry, Mark, but I can't," I said, my voice kind but unwavering. "My finances are carefully structured for my retirement and my travels. I know you two will figure it out. I now have a large map of the world pinned to the wall in my study. I have a red pin in Italy and another in Utah. There are a dozen yellow pins marking the places I want to see next. The fjords of Norway, the temples of Japan, the coast of Portugal. This is not a story of revenge. Revenge is a bitter, corrosive thing that would have kept me tied to them forever. This is a story of renaissance. I didn't set fire to their world. I simply left it and began cultivating my own garden. And I found that it was more beautiful and expansive than I had ever dared to imagine. I think often of that cruel text message. It's just a trip for our family. Those words were meant to be a cage, a final definition of my small place in their world. But they became the opposite. They became my permission slip. By drawing a line and putting me on the other side, they set me free. The greatest injury they inflicted on me was inadvertently the most profound gift they could have given. It forced me to stop looking for a seat at their table and to go out and build my own, a table large enough to feast at for the rest of my life. I have learned that your worth is not measured by the space you occupy in other people's lives. It is not defined by your title, mother, wife, grandmother. It is inherent, absolute, and non-negotiable. You must never, ever give someone else the power to validate your existence. You must never hand them the keys to your own happiness, because they might, without malice or thought, simply forget you are locked inside. Your life is your own grand adventure, and you are the only one who can decide when it begins. My late husband left me a financial fortune, but the real inheritance was the lesson embedded within it, the permission to live a life that was fully my own. It's a permission we all must eventually grant ourselves. They sent me a message to tell me I was not part of their journey, never realizing they were launching me on a much greater one. They wanted me to know my place, and I finally do. My place is not a chair in their house. My place is the world. My journey didn't begin with a ticket to Rome. It began with the quiet, revolutionary decision that I was worthy of the destination, and so are you. Today, my home is quiet, but it's a peaceful quiet. It's the sound of my own life. On my own terms. My world is no longer defined by a phone that doesn't ring. It's defined by the map on my wall and all the places I still plan to go. If this story reminded you of someone who found their strength, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Feel free to share this story, and let me know if you've ever had a moment that changed everything for you. And now, if you liked this story, subscribe to the channel and click on the next video that is appearing on the screen, because in it, there's a story of betrayal and a twist like you've never seen before.